I was sitting on the floor of my freezing dorm room, staring at a crumpled $20 bill. I was just trying to figure out how to stretch it for a week's worth of groceries. That's when everything I thought I knew completely shattered. I got this plain white envelope forwarded to my dorm by mistake. It had the seal of some toll authority in Arizona on it. I almost tossed it in the trash, considering I barely even owned a bike. But something told me to open it. Growing up, my parents constantly drilled it into my head that we were completely broke. Money was this dark cloud hanging over every single day of my childhood. I'd walk around in shoes with the soles literally peeling off, terrified to ask for a new pair. If I ever asked for anything, my mom would act like I just asked her to cut off her right arm. She'd rub her temples and launch into this massive guilt trip about how hard they worked. They acted like total martyrs about being poor. My dad played right along with it, acting like this worn-down guy carrying the weight of the world. He was always complaining about the cost of living and how the government was out to get his last dime. I truly believed we were one bad week away from being homeless. They kept the house so freezing in the winter that I literally had to wear my winter coat to bed. I'd just lie there, shivering, feeling this heavy financial anxiety sitting right on my chest. It made me absolutely terrified to spend money on anything. When it was time for college, my mom sat me down and put on this fake, sympathetic face. She told me there was zero money for school, and I was entirely on my own. They even refused to fill out my financial aid forms because they supposedly didn't trust the government. Because they wouldn't give up their tax info, I couldn't get any grants. I had to go to a cheap state school and work 3 part-time jobs just to survive. I'd work these brutal closing shifts at a diner and come home smelling like stale grease and pure exhaustion. I was basically living off ramen noodles and whatever stale pastries my boss let me take home. Every single penny I made went straight to tuition and rent. I had no safety net, no family support, nothing. I was fighting tooth and nail just to stay in school. Right after I left for college, my parents announced they were moving to Arizona. They claimed they found some tiny, cheap apartment where they could finally scrape by in peace. They packed up their beat-up car and just took off, leaving me to figure out my own life. I finally ripped the thing open, figuring it was just some weird junk mail or a scam. But it was a final collection notice from a toll authority in Arizona. It said my car was racking up massive fines. Right below the text was this grainy traffic camera photo. It showed the back of a brand new white Porsche Cayenne. And right underneath it, printed in bold black ink, was the registered owner's name. My name. I just stared at the paper until the letters literally started blurring together. I figured it had to be some bizarre clerical error, since my mom and I share the exact same name. But why would she have a luxury SUV when they were supposedly dead broke? My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grab my backpack. I practically sprinted across campus to the library so I could pull my credit report. I'd never even checked it before, because my parents always drilled it into my head to avoid debt like the plague. I found an empty terminal in the back of the library and logged on to a credit site. The screen was glowing in the dark room as I typed in my info. A cold knot formed in my stomach when the security questions popped up. It was asking me to verify stuff I had absolutely no clue about. Like which streets I'd lived on and which banks held my auto loans. I just guessed my way through them, my heart totally pounding out of my chest. When the page finally loaded, it felt like all the air just left my lungs. My credit score was a miserable 412. I just sat there in the quiet, feeling like the floor had completely dropped out from under me. the score wasn't even the worst part. It was the massive list of open accounts dragging me down. There were over a dozen maxed-out credit cards, luxury store accounts, and 3 huge auto loans. The total debt was over 300 grand. I started clicking through the details, just desperately trying to make sense of this absolute nightmare. I looked at the dates when the oldest accounts were opened. I did the math in my head, and then I did it again, my hands literally shaking. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. That first line of credit was opened when I was 14 years old. I was in middle school. My mom had taken my social security number and built this massive, fraudulent empire using my future as collateral. I just sat there in the library, letting the sheer scale of the betrayal wash over me. All those years of wearing shoes with holes in the soles and shivering in a freezing house flashed through my mind. Every lecture about how selfish I was for wanting a $10 field trip had been a complete and utter lie. They were never actually broke. They'd been hoarding their own money, maintaining this bizarre, miserly facade at home while building a massive, fraudulent empire of debt. And they were using my future, my literal identity, as the collateral to fund it all. It all made sickening sense now. Once they moved to Arizona, completely free of the community that knew them as the struggling, poor couple, they just let loose. They were living a double life, a country club fantasy entirely funded by my stolen identity. I didn't cry. I was honestly too shocked and furious to shed a single tear. Instead, I opened a new tab on the browser and typed in the billing address listed on the most recent credit card statements. It was an address in Scottsdale, Arizona. I pulled it up on a satellite map view, waiting for the high-resolution image to render on the slow library internet. When the image finally loaded on my screen, it confirmed every single suspicion I had. The satellite image showed a massive, sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion located inside a gated community. It came complete with a sparkling blue swimming pool in the backyard. And there, parked perfectly in the wide paved driveway, were 3 luxury vehicles. I stared at the undeniable proof of their theft for a long moment. Then I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cheap, cracked cell phone, and dialed my mother's number. It rang 4 times before she finally picked up. "Hello?" she said, her voice sounding incredibly relaxed and breezy. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing in the background and the gentle splash of water from her private pool. She had absolutely no idea that her house of cards was about to collapse. "I got a letter today," I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and steady. "From the toll authority in Maricopa County, about a white Porsche." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and immediate. The background noise of the television suddenly muted as she scrambled for the remote. I could hear her breathing heavily through the receiver. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, but her voice had completely lost its breezy quality. It was tight and defensive. I didn't back down. I just stared at the satellite image of her mansion on the screen. I told her I pulled my credit report and saw everything. The Porsche, the Range Rover, the Mercedes, all of it. The second I said that, her breezy facade completely vanished. There wasn't a single ounce of apology or shame in her voice, just immediate, vicious anger. She actually snapped at me for snooping into adult financial matters. She claimed they were just keeping assets under my name for tax purposes. My voice started rising as all those years of fake poverty flashed through my mind. I told her she stole my identity when I was in middle school. She ruined my credit before my life even started. I can't even rent a cheap apartment, and she's out there driving a Porsche." She screamed right back at me, her voice just dripping with entitlement and venom. She asked if I had any idea how much it cost to keep me fed and clothed. She actually said they sacrificed the best years of their lives for me. In her mind, I owed them this. She told me to stop being so dramatic and ungrateful. She reminded me that they were my parents, like that justified everything. And then she just hung up on me. The line went dead. I just sat there in the quiet hum of the library, listening to the dial tone. The reality of the situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was legally responsible for a mountain of debt I never authorized, and my own parents were the ones who trapped me. I knew I couldn't just ignore this, so I printed out my credit reports, grabbed the toll violation, and walked straight to the campus legal aid clinic. It was this tiny, cramped little office, but it was the only place I could think of to get help. I sat down across from the supervising attorney and just laid everything out on his desk. The credit reports, the toll violation, the satellite photo of their mansion. I walked him through the entire nightmare from start to finish. The attorney leaned forward and looked at me with this mix of profound pity and absolute seriousness. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He told me exactly what I was up against, and it wasn't good. He explained I basically had two choices. Option 1, I accept the debt and spend the next 20 years paying off my parents' luxury lifestyle. Or option 2, I file a police report for identity theft and fraud. But he warned me that would likely send my parents to federal prison. He told me to go home and think about it. He said it was the hardest decision a child could ever make, sending your own parents to federal prison. I walked back to my dorm room. I looked at the bare walls, the thrifted mattress on the floor, the stack of textbooks I was renting because I couldn't afford to buy them. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent on my feet at the diner, smiling at customers until my face ached just so I could afford to eat. And I thought about my mother, sitting by her private pool, angry at me for daring to notice she had stolen my future. They had never loved me. Not really. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a resource. I was a line of credit they used to fund their own delusions of grandeur. I didn't want to spend years tied up in federal court, watching them play the victims to a judge. I wanted this over. I wanted my life back. As I stared at the paperwork the attorney had given me, a third option suddenly crystallized in my mind. I looked closely at the vehicle registrations listed on the credit report. Because my mother used my exact name and social security number, she had also put the titles and registrations entirely in my name. Legally, in the eyes of the state of Arizona, those cars didn't belong to my parents. They belonged to me. The next morning, I didn't call the federal fraud department. I called the local police precinct in Scottsdale, Arizona. I spoke to a dispatcher and explained that I needed to report 3 stolen vehicles. I gave them the make, model, and license plates of the Porsche, the Range Rover, and the Mercedes. And I told them exactly where the vehicles were parked. When the dispatcher asked who had taken them, I gave them my parents' names. I explained that I was the sole legal owner, and that these individuals had taken my property without authorization. Because my name was the only name on the registration, the police treated it as a straightforward case of grand theft auto. I just sat there in my freezing dorm room, staring at my phone. I knew it was only a matter of time before the bomb went off. It took exactly 3 hours for the explosion to happen. My phone started vibrating across the desk. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail the first few times, but it just kept ringing and ringing, so I finally picked it up. The second I put the phone to my ear, she was screaming so loud the speaker was clipping. She sounded completely unhinged. It was this frantic, desperate shrieking I had never heard from her before. She's yelling that the cops are at the house and they're putting my dad in handcuffs. Through the phone, I could actually hear the heavy rumble of tow trucks pulling into their driveway. They were taking the cars. I kept my voice completely flat. I just told her I reported my property stolen. I mean, it was my property. She made sure of that when she put my social security number on all the paperwork. All that anger just instantly collapsed into sheer panic. She started sobbing, begging me to tell the cops it was a mistake. She wanted me to say I gave them permission to take the cars. I calmly told her I couldn't do that because then I'd be on the hook for the payments. I threw her own words right back at her. I said, "You can't afford a Porsche, Mom. You're broke, remember?" She screamed that she would never forgive me. She told me I was dead to her and that I was ruining their lives. I just said, "You ruined mine when I was 14. Have a nice life in Arizona." I pulled the phone away from my ear and hung up. Then I blocked her number. I blocked my dad's number and every single account connected to them. I cut them out of my life right then and there. The fallout was pretty spectacular. Since the cops recovered the vehicles, I was able to contact the banks and just voluntarily surrender the cars. It didn't clear everything, but it wiped out a massive chunk of that debt. I wasn't going to let the credit card debt slide either. I took that police report straight back to the legal aid clinic. It was time to drop the hammer on the rest of those accounts. I sat back down with the attorney and laid the report on his desk. We used it as leverage to file formal identity theft affidavits with the credit bureaus. He helped me draft everything so the banks couldn't ignore it. I didn't even have to push for federal prison time myself. Once the banks realized the accounts were fraudulent, they froze everything immediately. They did the heavy lifting, turning their own lawyers against my parents to get their money back. My parents' carefully constructed country club fantasy collapsed practically overnight. Without my credit to prop them up, their whole house of cards just disintegrated. They were completely locked out, unable to pay for the lifestyle they felt so entitled to. I heard through a relative months later that the fallout was absolute. They got formally evicted from that massive Scottsdale mansion. Their wages were garnished, and they were facing huge civil suits from the credit card companies. They were forced back into a tiny, cramped apartment, stripped of all their stolen luxury. But this time, the poverty wasn't some performance. It was entirely real, and they had no one left to steal from. Meanwhile, clearing my name took nearly 2 years of constant, grueling work. I spent hours on the phone, fighting with credit bureaus and navigating endless automated menus. It felt like an exhausting, infuriating second job. I was constantly mailing out thick stacks of certified letters, proving the fraud over and over again. Every free moment between classes and work was spent tracking down documents. I refused to let a single fake charge stay on my record. But slowly, month by month, the fraudulent accounts were finally wiped from my history. I remember logging in and seeing my credit score finally climb out of the basement. A massive weight just lifted off my chest. I graduated from college, got a decent job, and packed up that bleak little dorm room for the last time. I was moving into an apartment I rented completely on my own merit. I survived them, and my future was finally mine. I haven't spoken to my parents since the day the tow trucks showed up. I don't miss them. I had were a complete fiction. That struggling couple doing their best, just an illusion. I spent my whole life feeling bad for a mirage. The people they actually were? Selfish, manipulative thieves. They looked at their own kid and just saw a blank check. They were parasites, hiding behind a mask of poverty. Once I saw them for what they truly were, all that guilt just vanished. I was more than happy to cut them out forever. Walking away was the easiest thing I've ever done. Sometimes, when it's quiet, I think back to the girl I used to be. That terrified, anxious kid carrying the weight of the world. She was so small and so stressed out. I remember being too afraid to ask for a $5 notebook for school. I'd sit in class, erasing old pages just to reuse them. I was terrified of causing a financial crisis. I think about the girl who walked around in the dead of winter with no coat. I'd shiver at the bus stop, pretending I was tough. I just knew they'd scream if I asked for clothes.
For years, I was absolutely convinced I was a massive burden to my family. Every bite of food felt like a debt I couldn't repay. I tried to make myself as invisible as possible.
Looking back at her now, my heart just breaks. I wish I could reach back through time and pull her out of that freezing house. I wish I could give her the safety she deserved. More than anything, I wish I could go back and tell her the truth. I'd hold her by the shoulders and make her listen. I'd tell her it wasn't her fault, and she was never the problem. I look around my place now, and it's just mine. Every single thing here is something I earned. Nobody can hold it over my head or use it against me, but my mind still drifts back to that freezing cinder block room. I used to sit on the floor of my dorm, eating cheap ramen. I was just so exhausted, trying to survive the week. I'd stare at those peeling walls and wonder what was wrong with me. I constantly asked myself why I wasn't enough for them to invest in. I really thought I just wasn't worth it. It took a long time to unlearn that lie. Now, I know the absolute truth about who they were. They never saw me as a daughter. I was just an asset. Meanwhile, their little fantasy world completely crumbled. I heard they're back in a tiny, cramped apartment, drowning in lawsuits. The poverty they used to fake? Yeah, it's real now. She doesn't have her country club or her sparkling pool anymore. She's just sitting in a dingy room, stripped of all that stolen wealth. And the best part is, she has no one left to manipulate. I don't feel sorry for them. Not even a little bit. I'm closing that chapter of my life with total peace. That heavy, suffocating anxiety I grew up with is finally gone. I grab my keys and head out the door. I've got a good job, a clean credit score, and a future that's all mine. Every step forward just feels incredibly light. I think about the twisted irony of what they did. They used my name to build their empire because I was a blank slate. They really did invest in me. They poured all their fraud into my identity, assuming I'd take the fall. But they underestimated the resilience they forced me to build. They invested in me. They just didn't expect me to cash out. Sometimes I think back to the girl I used to be, the one who walked around in winter with no coat. She was so convinced she was just this massive burden to her family. I wish I could go back and tell her the truth. I'd tell her to stop apologizing for taking up space. I'd tell her that the whole story they fed her was a lie. I wish I could tell her that she wasn't a burden. She was actually the only thing keeping them afloat.
Her future was the foundation of their whole fake empire. I used to sit on the floor of my dorm, eating ramen, just staring at the walls, wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why I wasn't enough for them to invest in. It took years to finally see it clearly. They never saw me as a daughter to love. They just looked at me and saw a blank check. Now, standing on the other side of it all, I know the truth. I don't carry their shame anymore. And I realize they actually did invest in me. They poured all their greed into my name. They built their whole lavish lifestyle on my identity. They assumed I'd always be too scared to fight back. But they underestimated the resilience they forced me to build. They taught me how to survive on nothing. So I had nothing to lose when I burned their empire down. The irony is, their plan worked perfectly, right up until I took control. They invested in me. They just didn't expect me to cash out. I finally have my life back, and this time it belongs entirely to me.